So let's get started. Hi everybody, thanks for coming to my talk. My name is Sebastian, or Seb for short, and I'm going to walk you through a couple of things that I discovered while working with Django. Just first things first, I've been a Django developer for about the last 4 or 5 years now, and have been working with Python for a little bit longer than that. So I've been working with Django for 5 years, and that's sort of me sharing a couple of things that I picked up along the way. Currently, I work for a company called Mobify in Vancouver in Canada, and it's actually quite interesting coming from that currently very cold place down here to this very nice and warm place. So I appreciate the opportunity to get a little bit of a peek into the summer. The presentation is going to be available on Django Treasures Hunt. That's a bit.ly link to my speaker deck. There's going to be a couple of links in there that you might want to check out if you're interested. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm Al-Bashid on GitHub and Twitter. All right, let's go look for some treasure. When I say treasure, I'm not talking about the things that, as Django developers, we know and really appreciate about the framework, like forms and views and models and the ORM. Who here is a Django developer or has used Django before? Okay, so you pretty much know at least some of those things and probably appreciate them or hate them, like class-based view. Some people don't like that. But that's not what I'm going to talk about, because they are really well documented. There are good tutorials out there. From what I hear, the Django Girls tutorial is especially good for beginners to get started. What I want to talk about is the more hidden treasures, things that are in the Django code base that I found to be really useful, but they are documented, but they aren't that prominent. There is no reference in the tutorial. If you go through the API documentation, you might find them, but there's also not necessarily too many really good examples on how they might be useful to you outside of what Django already does. So I'm going to just pick out some of the examples that I've found and walk you through them. First, though, a little bit about why or how I found these things myself. Because I've been working with Django for quite a long time, one of the things that I've done frequently is touch on the Django source code, go on GitHub, look through the code, and trying to understand why is Django behaving the way it does. What am I doing wrong so that Django doesn't understand what I'm trying to do? And one part of that is I basically found a couple of pieces of code that I realized are something that I've written in my own code base, which already is, better developed, better tested inside of Django. On top of that, I was lucky enough over the last few years to work with a couple of really smart people. The ones of you that have been on the IRC Django channel probably know the name Funky Bob. His real name is Curtis Maloney. He's from Australia, from Melbourne in Australia, and I used to live there and see him on every meetup, and he's been an incredible inspiration and a source for those little pieces of treasure. So yeah, IRC channel is something to look into, just to hang out or ask questions there, because there are some really smart and really helpful people there. And then conferences, places like this, and the sprints that happen after some of those conferences, where you can actually work with people from a little bit further away that are also really experienced and might complement what you already know. But, long story, let's make it short and look at some actual treasures that I think could be really valuable. And I hope that each one of you might go home with at least one thing that they didn't know before. One of my personal favorites is the cache property decorator. The cache property decorator is basically, as I said, a decorator. And it behaves like the property decorator that comes with Python itself. But it gives you the opportunity to cache the value that you return in the function of your property on that instance as long as the instance lives. So if you have something, if you have something that's a little bit expensive to generate, you can basically, instead of use @property, you'd use @cache_property, and the result that comes back is cached on the instance. So if you use it in 5 different places on a template, you don't have to do that computation 5 times. That's basically what I said. So let's look at an example. Let's say we have colors, like we have a web application and you can type in a color, hex code for it, and it gives you back what the name of that color is. And there is an API that basically does the matching, so all I want to do is build that UI layer for it. And here is a class that I've modeled this. So I pass in the hex value in the init function, and then I have my property that gives me the name back. And what this property basically does is it uses an API endpoint, uses requests, takes that hex code and gives me the title for that color back. Fairly straightforward, probably the first way to implement that. It has a problem though. Every time I do color.name, I make a web request. And whatever that service is, that service might go down, or there might be high latency for some reason. So every time I use that, it'll slow the website that I'm generating down. One way of speeding that up is, oh, well, I can do that myself. I'm just going to check if there is an _name attribute on that class. If not, I do the calculation, call the API, store it on the instance. But then I have to go and test that. I don't like writing tests that I don't have to write. I also don't like writing code that I don't have to write. The alternative is basically using the cache property and just do exactly the same thing that we were doing before, but say, this is a cache property, so whatever comes out of this is going to be cached on the instance for its lifetime. And that's all you have to do. So basically what this turns into is I have my color, I do name, and it does the first request, gives me the name back, and if I do it again, once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, it gives me just the name back because it's cached on the instance. There's one caveat with that. If you do query sets, so you make lookups on the database, and if you have like complex database queries, maybe for this specific property, that might make sense. But if you do a query set, you have to be really careful because query sets are lazy, which means they are only evaluated when you're trying to access the content that comes out of it. So this will actually cache the query set, not the actual database query. If you want this to be properly cached, you probably have to turn it into a list or some sort of iterable that underneath evaluates that query set. And all you need to know is basically the Django utils functional package module has cache property. You import that, you use it, works, easy peasy. And as I said, these are, I'm going to have the Django docs link and the source link in there for if you want to check it out later. So this is our first treasure. And the next one I want to talk about is the import string. You probably have seen, like in the configuration of Django, the settings file, stuff like the context processors that are strings of dotted path to a module or a class. And what the import string does is basically take that string of a dotted path and turn it into whatever the class or the function is that is referenced by that. Or if it doesn't exist, it gives you an import error. So basically, if we import that, and we use something like request.get, which you would usually import using from requests import get, what you get out of this is exactly the same thing. It does the same thing under the hood, plus some validation and checking. And then you can use the function exactly the same way you would usually use request.get. So where can that be really useful? If you're not necessarily in your own project, but maybe if you're developing a little package that you're using across multiple of your projects, you might want to do a validator that is different in the projects. And instead of having to change the code in every project, you just have a setting that references a dotted path, and then you load that instead of having to change code in both code bases. So that's one of the things that I've done in a couple of places and have seen in a couple of other projects. So for example, let's imagine we're building a little framework around a web store. And one of the things that we want to use is nice IDs instead of just the regular primary keys that come out of a product model or something like that. And so I want to use slug. The default in Django is using slugify, but I really love emojis. So I want emojis in every product's slug. And so what I can do is basically, I can say in my settings file, I've got this function that turns every product into a slug that contains emojis, whatever that means, and this is what I want to use. And then I have my own slugify function that I'm using that basically takes that function, imports it based on that string identifier, and just applies it to whatever value I pass it. And that way I get my own slugify function that is customized without having to actually hard code which slugifier I want to use. And basically all you need to know is in the Django utils package, there is a module underscore loading. You import the import path and you get a lot of things for free, like validation and stuff. The only thing you have to remember is if it's an import error, you still have to catch that. One more treasure. Yeah? No, just go. That's a good point. It's been import by path before. I've got it at the end, which version they changed it, and like they started deprecating it, and I think 1.8 they removed the old one and it's only import string. But it's I think it started being available in 1.6. Before that it was import by path, I think. Same functionality, just different name. All right. As I mentioned before in query sets are evaluated lazily. That functionality comes out of lazy as a function or LazyObject as a class. And they are really useful in delaying execution of a callable. So let's say I have a function that's supposed to do something, but I can't do that at the parse time of my file, so I want to delay that, and I'll show you an example in a minute. I can just wrap that in either lazy or a LazyObject and delay execution until someone is trying to use what comes out of my function. So similar to that, what query sets do basically. And the settings module is another example for that. So basically, as I said, it's useful for settings that you want to use in places that are not within a function, but like an attribute that you define on a class that's parsed at parse time, like read at parse time. One very prominent example is translations. If you use translations with like the uGetText module in Django, you usually put those strings into a function call to uGetText, which you have, for example, in class meta of your class description. That gets evaluated at parse time, and it'll blow up when you're trying to use that, unless everything is already configured and loaded. One other example is reverse. If you've ever tried to use reverse as a success under URL on a class-based view, that won't work, because at the time the module is parsed, the URL.py isn't fully loaded, and depending on where you are in the setup or configuration process, this might basically say, I don't know about any URL that's called home. So the way to get around that is using the lazy function, specifying the function call as you normally would, and returning, giving it the type of the return value, and it'll basically wrap it in a way that it'll only execute that function at the point when it actually needs a value for it. Where this came in handy for me personally was I was looking at providing private subdirectories in an S3 bucket on Amazon for user-specific storage. So because I can define a storage for a custom storage for a file field, this is like how I would do it naively. I plug that in, and it'll blow up. Whoops. A way to get around that is basically using LazyObject or simple LazyObject. Have a function that returns whatever the storage is, and then have my simple object wrap that function call saying, like, I don't want to know what's in there or what's coming out of it until I actually need it. And then you can pass that LazyObject in here, and it will take some time until it actually evaluates it, like when it first tries to access it, which makes it easier, especially in the S3 case where you have configuration values that are asserted at load time. So maybe the settings aren't loaded properly at that point in time. And these are both available in the Django utils package in the functional module. So as you can see, there is a pattern. It's mostly under the Django utils package. There is a lot of stuff in the functional module specifically. It's really useful. And we have one more treasure that we've found. Just a quick reference, but this is really nice for testing. So if you've ever written a a middleware that processes requests or responses, these are actually quite tricky to test properly because you have to have a request object, and depending on what you're doing within that request, it's getting really tricky to actually mock that. So this is an easy way of creating a request that behaves exactly like a Django request, because it is a Django request, without having to go through a full web test cycle or something like that. And the way it works is simple. You just have your RequestFactory. You do a get, or if you want a post or a put, it basically has all the HTTP methods. And you give it a path or everything that a get method would need, like a query string or something like that. And what you get back is a Django request. So it's useful, or I found it to be useful in testing, because you can basically generate requests without having to go through the full cycle. And it saves you so much time in mocking up things. And as I said, if we look at some middleware, and I have this custom processing of requests, what I'm going to do is I look at the RequestFactory, I've got some query parameters that I want to use in my function. I pass them in, I get a request back, and then I can just call that, and with the whatever comes out of that, I can basically assert it on that request, or whatever the side effects are of my middleware. I can potentially reject, like looking at the token. If the token isn't valid, I can reject that. Basically, in short, that's the RequestFactory. It's in Django test, and it's actually probably the more widely used of the hidden treasures that I'm talking about. And then the last one is one that I've just found recently, which is called method decorator, which is an interesting thing. It's a decorator that wraps a decorator when you put it on a method. Why would you need that? So the way you use it is you just put it on, for example, a view here. You have a dispatch method. You want to apply a function decorator, and you use the method decorator to turn your function decorator into a method decorator. That might sound a little bit convoluted, but if you're looking at something like Waffle, which I was using in that case, Waffle is a framework that allows you to create feature flags and hide certain things from certain users until you're certain that they are production ready. And it comes with a very handy decorator called Waffle flag that checks if my new feature should be shown to that user or not. But the assumption that the author made is that views in Django are function views. Well, I'm a big fan of class-based views, which is controversial. But because of that, I can't really use that decorator. Or I can wrap that decorator and do something different about it. So that I have my own decorator that works with my setup, my ways of using views. Or I can use the method decorator, which in this case turns my function decorator in a decorator that I can apply to that dispatch method. It's actually even easier than that. I can just wrap it around my class and say, apply it to a function that's called dispatch, so I don't have to overwrite the dispatch method, return it, just calling super, and have those 2 extra lines in there. And yeah, and that made my life really a lot easier because I don't have to worry about how that works or doesn't work. And that, again, lives in the Django utils functional package. And with that, I've hopefully shown you a couple of little treasures that are scattered around the Django code base, and given you an idea of what kind of things you don't necessarily have to write yourself. Just as a reminder, this is the URL for the slides if you want to look at the documentation, look at the code. And the sub there is me if you want to know more or anything really. And then I'll do questions. No questions? Yeah.
When you were talking about the first ratio, is the class property?
Mm-hmm.
Just wondering what happens if you use like some params to recover, going to cache by params, something like that?
So the properties in Python itself expect that the method that you're using only takes self as an argument. So you can't parameterize a property. And the same is true for the cache property. It behaves exactly the same. Yep. No, you go.
Okay. About the LazyObject, I see that you said that it delays the execution of a kind of function. So that is like to be used like in asynchronous programming, or like for example when another function finish calculating something and then calls like a callback, like kind of.
So when you apply the LazyObject to your function, you're basically storing a proxy object. And the first time, so Python is smart enough to figure out when it actually wants the value back. So the first time you're trying to get the value on that object, the object takes that function that you configured, executes it, and returns that value instead. So you basically add one layer of indirection, but it's generally, the use case is just in regular sequential execution of your code. It just gets executed at the time when it's needed rather than at the time where you assign it. There was a question in the back.
On the cache properties and within QUERYSETS, right? So create a property that returns query set. You cache that, but it's cached the actual query set, not the list that I just want to access. But say, okay, I can see how that's a problem because you don't have the items. But once that query set gets evaluated for the first time, you call that property several times. Is that don't you get the lazy query set gets evaluated, it's a copy of the stuff in the database for the next time you execute it?
That's a good point. I think you're right that the query set internally handles caching, so it might actually turn out that way. I remember that I had a problem once with a cache property and getting multiple database calls, but that might just be me having done something.
I was actually trying to look in the source code right now, but there are some deep copies there, so maybe it copies the query set.
Yeah, okay. It's definitely something interesting. Maybe we can just afterwards just hack it together and see what it does. Any other questions? All right. Thank you.